Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode here on the English Globe. I'm Adam, and joining me today is my co-host, Julia. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into world history. And please, let us know in the comments where you are listening from. We love seeing our global community. Share your thoughts about today's topic too, because this is one of the most fascinating moments in modern history.
That's right, Adam. Today we're looking at the fall of the Soviet Union, a global turning point. This is a huge topic, not just for historians, but for anyone who wants to understand the way our world is shaped today. The collapse of the USSR didn't just affect the people living in its borders. It transformed international politics, reshaped economies, and influenced the culture of entire regions. It's a story of ideology, reform, resistance, and change on a massive scale.
For those who might be newer to the topic, the Soviet Union, or USSR, was a socialist state made up of multiple republics that existed from 1922 until 1991. At its height, it was one of the two global superpowers, standing toe-to-toe with the United States in what became known as the Cold War. But by the early 1990s, this giant collapsed almost overnight, leaving the world shocked and scrambling to adjust to a new reality.
And here's what makes it so intriguing. The fall wasn't the result of just one thing. There were deep economic issues, political reforms that spiraled beyond control, and rising nationalist movements within the republics. Then there were international pressures, a changing global economy, and the influence of the media. Together, all these elements created a perfect storm that brought down one of the most powerful nations in modern history.
Over the course of today's episode, Julia and I will break down the key moments that led to the Soviet Union's collapse. We'll explore the political climate before the fall, the economic stagnation that eroded confidence in the system, the reforms introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev, and how those reforms unintentionally sped up the end. We'll also talk about the independence movements, the failed coup of 1991, and the final days before the USSR dissolved completely.
And beyond the events themselves, we're going to look at what the collapse meant for the rest of the world. The end of the Soviet Union was not just the end of the Cold War. It marked a shift from a bipolar world to one dominated by a single superpower, the United States. This shift had huge consequences for global politics, economics, and even culture. It also left behind complex legacies in the newly independent states, legacies that still shape their politics and societies today.
So, whether you're listening from Moscow, New York, London, Delhi, or anywhere else in the world, this is a story that connects to you in some way. And that's why we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're listening from and what you think about the Soviet Union's collapse. Do you see it as inevitable? Do you think things could have gone differently if certain decisions were made? Your insights make these conversations even richer.
Exactly. And as we go through this, remember that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about people, their choices, and their experiences. The fall of the Soviet Union affected millions of lives directly and billions indirectly. It reshaped alliances, redrew borders, and changed the course of countless personal stories. Some people found freedom and opportunity. Others faced hardship, uncertainty, and loss.
We'll try to bring you not just the political and economic angles, but also some of those human stories, the ones that remind us that history is lived by ordinary people. And we'll take a balanced view, because while the collapse brought new freedoms for many, it also brought instability, economic crises, and new conflicts. It's important to see both sides of the story to understand why it happened and what it meant.
And if you're someone who's learning English, don't worry. We're going to explain everything clearly without too much complex vocabulary. This way, you can enjoy the story, improve your language skills, and learn about a major historical event all at once. We want this podcast to be not only informative, but also easy to follow, no matter your level of English.
So buckle up, because we're going to travel back in time to the late 20th century, a time when the world was divided between two ideologies, when nuclear tensions ran high, and when the Soviet Union still seemed like it would last forever. But within just a few years, everything changed. And by the end of 1991, the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin.
We'll start by looking at what the Soviet Union was like before the fall, its political structure, its ideology, and its place in the world. This background will help us understand not just how it collapsed, but why it was so significant. So, let's begin our journey into the final chapter of one of history's most powerful empires. To understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, we first need to look at what it actually was and how it operated in the years before the fall. The USSR, short for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was a massive state made up of 15 republics, stretching across Eastern Europe and Asia. It was officially founded in 1922 after the Russian Revolution and the Civil War that followed, bringing together territories that had been part of the old Russian Empire.
The Soviet Union was built on the ideology of Marxism-Leninism, which aimed to create a classless society where the means of production were owned collectively. In theory, it promised equality, social welfare, and an end to the exploitation of workers. In practice, it developed into a highly centralized, one-party state, with the Communist Party controlling politics, the economy, and much of everyday life. Power was concentrated in Moscow, and decisions were often made by a small group of leaders at the top.
By the mid-20th century, the USSR had transformed into one of the world's two superpowers, rivaling the United States in almost every field, from military strength to space exploration. The space race was one of its proudest achievements, with milestones like launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, and sending Yuri Gagarin, the first human, into space. These successes fed a sense of national pride and reinforced the image of the Soviet Union as a technological and scientific powerhouse.
But the Soviet system also had its limitations. Its economy was centrally planned, meaning the government decided what would be produced, how much, and at what price. While this system allowed for rapid industrial growth in the early years, it also led to inefficiencies, shortages, and waste. Factories were often rewarded for meeting production targets, regardless of whether what they produced was actually useful or of high quality. This created a gap between official statistics and the daily reality of citizens.
Politically, the Soviet Union was a closed society. The media was strictly controlled, censorship was common, and dissent was not tolerated. The KGB, the state security agency, kept a close watch on political opponents, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. While there were elections, they were tightly managed, so that only Communist Party-approved candidates could win. The idea of political competition simply didn't exist in the way it does in most democracies.
The Cold War defined much of the Soviet Union's existence after World War II. This was a period of intense rivalry with the United States, marked by an arms race, ideological competition, and a series of proxy wars around the world. The Soviet Union sought to spread its model of socialism, while the U.S. promoted capitalism and liberal democracy. This struggle wasn't just about politics, it was also about proving which system could deliver a better life for its people and allies.
In the decades leading up to its collapse, the Soviet Union maintained a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe through a network of allied socialist states, often referred to as the Eastern Bloc. Countries like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were not part of the USSR itself, but they followed similar political and economic systems under Soviet guidance. This influence was sometimes maintained through military intervention, such as in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968.
Life inside the Soviet Union was a mix of pride and frustration. On one hand, the state provided free education, healthcare, and guaranteed employment. On the other, consumer goods were often scarce. Queues for basic items were common, and private enterprise was virtually non-existent. Many people lived in small apartments in large housing blocks, and while urban areas had more resources, rural regions sometimes struggled with outdated infrastructure and limited services.
The Soviet leadership, especially during the Brezhnev era in the 1970s and early 1980s, promoted stability above all else. Brezhnev's time in power was marked by what many historians call a period of stagnation. There was little innovation in governance, and the system relied heavily on routine, bureaucracy, and the status quo. This stability came at a cost. It made the system resistant to change, even when change was badly needed.
Another important aspect to remember is the role of ideology in everyday life. From school education to workplace culture, Soviet citizens were constantly exposed to messages about the superiority of socialism and the importance of loyalty to the state. This shaped generations of people, but it also created tension when the gap between official propaganda and real-life conditions became too wide to ignore. By the 1980s, that gap was becoming hard to hide.
Internationally, the Soviet Union was respected and feared in equal measure. Its vast military nuclear arsenal and space achievements made it a force to be reckoned with. But its closed political system and economic inefficiencies were weaknesses that outsiders could see. For decades, these flaws were manageable, but as global economic and technological change accelerated, the USSR's rigid system struggled to keep up. The seeds of its eventual fall were already being planted.
This was the Soviet Union in the years before the fall, a vast, powerful, and proud nation with serious internal challenges just below the surface. It's this combination of strength and vulnerability that makes its sudden collapse so fascinating. In our next section, we'll examine one of the most important pieces of that puzzle: the economic stagnation and crises that weakened the Soviet system from within.
Now that we've painted a picture of the Soviet Union before the fall, it's time to dig into one of the most critical factors behind its collapse: the economy. For much of the early Soviet period, central planning helped transform the USSR from a largely agrarian society into a major industrial power. Huge factories, massive infrastructure projects, and rapid urbanization were all achievements of the system. But by the 1970s and 1980s, that same system was showing deep cracks.
The Soviet economic model was based on a command economy, where the state decided what would be produced, how much, and at what price. In theory, this was supposed to prevent waste and ensure resources were distributed fairly. In practice, it created a system where meeting production quotas mattered more than meeting real needs. If a factory was told to produce a certain tonnage of steel, it did so even if the steel wasn't needed, while shortages of everyday consumer goods went unresolved.
This focus on heavy industry and military production meant that consumer industries lagged far behind. Ordinary citizens could get a job, and basic services like healthcare and education were free. But finding a pair of quality shoes, fresh fruit, or a modern television could be a challenge. People often stood in long queues for basic goods, and sometimes they had to rely on personal connections, known as blat, to get what they needed. This shortage economy slowly wore down public trust.
By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was spending an enormous portion of its budget on the military, partly because of the arms race with the United States. The Cold War competition in nuclear weapons, conventional forces, and space technology put a huge strain on the economy. While the U.S. could rely on a dynamic, market-driven economy to support its defense spending, the Soviet Union's centralized system struggled to balance military needs with civilian demands.
Another blow came from the global oil market. The USSR was a major oil producer, and high oil prices in the 1970s had helped mask some of its economic problems. But when prices fell sharply in the mid-1980s, the country lost a major source of hard currency. This made it even harder to import goods from abroad, especially modern technology, which was essential for improving productivity and keeping up with the West in critical industries.
Agriculture was another persistent weakness. Despite having vast farmlands, the Soviet Union struggled to feed its population efficiently. Collective farms, which were state-run, often suffered from poor management and low motivation among workers. Yields were inconsistent, and in bad years, the USSR had to import grain from countries like the United States, an embarrassing admission for a superpower that prided itself on self-sufficiency.
The inefficiency of the system also meant that innovation was slow. In the West, competition between companies drove constant improvement. In the Soviet Union, there was little incentive for managers or workers to innovate because the rewards were minimal and risks could lead to punishment. Without competition, technology lagged behind, especially in consumer electronics, computing, and advanced manufacturing methods.
Corruption and waste became serious problems. Officials often inflated production numbers to look good on paper, while real output could be much lower. Resources were sometimes allocated based on political connections rather than real need. This bred cynicism among citizens, who saw a growing gap between official propaganda and their daily lives. Over time, the system's legitimacy began to erode.
It's important to note that not all the problems were purely economic. They were tied closely to politics and ideology. Admitting that the system wasn't working meant questioning the very foundations of the Soviet state. Leaders were reluctant to make deep reforms because it could weaken their grip on power. This reluctance kept the country locked in an outdated economic model long after it had stopped delivering results.
By the early 1980s, the Soviet economy was stagnant. Growth had slowed to a crawl, productivity was low, and the gap between the USSR and the West in terms of technology and living standards was widening. The leadership knew something had to change, but change in such a rigid system was risky. It's in this climate of economic trouble and political caution that Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power, and he believed he had a plan to save the Soviet Union.
But as we'll see in the next part of our discussion, Gorbachev's reforms, Perestroika and Glasnost, were like opening a tightly sealed bottle. Once the lid was lifted, the pressure that had been building for decades came rushing out, and it couldn't be put back in. His efforts to modernize the economy and open society to more transparency would set in motion a chain of events that the leadership could no longer fully control. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet leadership knew that the status quo couldn't continue. The economy was stagnant, living standards were falling behind the West, and public dissatisfaction was quietly growing. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. At just 54 years old, he was much younger than his predecessors, and he came with a reputation for being energetic, intelligent, and open to new ideas. Many saw him as the fresh face the Soviet Union needed.
Gorbachev understood that without significant change, the Soviet Union risked falling further behind economically and politically. He introduced two key policies that became the defining features of his leadership: Perestroika, meaning restructuring, and Glasnost, meaning openness. These were not just slogans, they represented a dramatic shift in how the government approached economic management and political transparency.
Let's start with Perestroika. This was Gorbachev's attempt to modernize the Soviet economy by introducing elements of market economics into the centralized system. He allowed some private businesses to operate, gave managers more control over production decisions, and tried to encourage efficiency and innovation. The idea was to make the economy more dynamic without abandoning socialism. It was a delicate balance, and not everyone in the party supported it.
The second policy, Glasnost, was perhaps even more revolutionary. It aimed to increase openness in government and society. Under Glasnost, censorship was relaxed, and people could discuss political and social issues more freely. Newspapers began publishing critical articles about corruption, historical mistakes, and policy failures. Citizens were encouraged to voice their opinions, and for the first time in decades, public debate flourished.
These reforms were meant to strengthen the Soviet system by making it more adaptable and responsive. But they also exposed deep problems that had been hidden for years. Once people were allowed to speak openly, the extent of economic inefficiency, environmental damage, and political repression became clear. Instead of restoring faith in the system, Glasnost sometimes had the opposite effect. It made people question whether the system could be saved at all.
Gorbachev also sought to reduce Cold War tensions with the West. He met with U.S. President Ronald Reagan in a series of high-profile summits, signing arms control agreements like the INF Treaty in 1987. These steps reduced the risk of nuclear confrontation and earned him praise internationally. At home, however, some hardliners saw these moves as a sign of weakness, believing that the Soviet Union was giving up too much to its rivals.
Another consequence of Glasnost was the rise of nationalist movements within the Soviet republics. People in places like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, and Ukraine began demanding more autonomy, and in some cases, full independence. They saw the new openness as an opportunity to reclaim cultural identity and political freedom that had been suppressed under Moscow's control. Gorbachev wanted to keep the Union together, but it was becoming harder to contain these movements.
Economically, Perestroika had mixed results. Some sectors saw improvements, but the transition was messy. Prices were still largely controlled, supply chains were inefficient, and inflation began to rise. The partial reforms disrupted the old system without fully creating a new one, leading to shortages, frustration, and uncertainty. Many ordinary citizens felt that life was actually getting harder, not better.
Politically, the new openness also weakened the Communist Party's monopoly on power. In 1989, competitive elections were introduced for the Congress of People's Deputies, and many non-communist candidates won seats. For a system that had relied on one-party control for decades, this was a profound shift. It marked the beginning of genuine political pluralism in the Soviet Union. But it also eroded the authority of the old guard.
Gorbachev found himself caught between two powerful forces. On one side were the conservatives within the party who thought he was moving too fast and undermining socialism. On the other side were reformers and nationalists who believed he wasn't moving fast enough toward democracy and independence. Trying to balance these opposing pressures proved to be one of the most difficult challenges of his leadership.
By the late 1980s, the reforms had set in motion a wave of change that could no longer be fully controlled. The Soviet people had tasted freedom of speech and political choice, and many were unwilling to go back. At the same time, economic troubles deepened, and nationalist movements grew stronger. What began as an effort to save the Soviet Union was, in many ways, speeding up its disintegration.
In our next section, we'll take a closer look at those nationalist movements, how they emerged, why they gained momentum, and the role they played in pulling the Soviet Union apart. This is where the story becomes even more complex, as we see local identities and historical grievances challenge the very idea of a united Soviet state.
One of the most powerful forces unleashed by Gorbachev's reforms was nationalism. For decades, the Soviet Union had presented itself as a family of nations united under socialism. But the reality was more complicated. Many of the 15 republics had their own languages, cultures, and histories that predated the USSR. Some had been independent states before being absorbed into the Soviet system. Under Glasnost, people began openly celebrating these identities again, and that pride often came with demands for political independence.
The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were among the first to push openly for independence. These small nations on the Baltic Sea had been annexed by the Soviet Union during World War II, and their incorporation was never recognized by many Western countries. With the new political openness, independence movements in the Baltics gained momentum quickly. Massive demonstrations, known as the Singing Revolution, brought hundreds of thousands of people together to demand freedom.
In 1989, one of the most symbolic acts of unity took place in the Baltics. On August 23rd, nearly 2 million people joined hands to form a human chain stretching over 600 kilometers across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This event, known as the Baltic Way, was organized to mark the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret Nazi-Soviet agreement that had led to their annexation. The message was clear. They wanted to end Soviet rule.
But the Baltics weren't alone. In the Caucasus region, republics like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan were experiencing their own nationalist awakenings. Historical grievances, cultural pride, and economic frustrations all played a role. In Armenia, a movement emerged around the demand to unite with Nagorno-Karabakh, a region with a majority Armenian population that was part of Azerbaijan. This dispute sparked protests, clashes, and violence that tested Moscow's ability to keep control.
Ukraine, the second largest republic in the USSR, also began asserting its independence. With a population of more than 50 million, Ukraine had its own language, culture, and a long history of resisting outside domination. In the late 1980s, Ukrainian activists pushed for greater autonomy, and the movement gained strength through cultural revival, environmental protests, and political organizing. By 1991, Ukraine's push for independence would become a decisive moment in the USSR's breakup.
Central Asia was more complicated. Republics like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan were deeply tied to the Soviet economy, and many leaders there were loyal to Moscow. But even in these regions, Glasnost encouraged public discussions about cultural identity and local history. People began questioning why so many decisions about their lives were made thousands of kilometers away in the Kremlin. Slowly, a sense of regional nationalism began to take root.
Nationalism didn't always mean peaceful protest. In some republics, ethnic tensions that had been suppressed for decades came to the surface. In places like Azerbaijan and Armenia, Georgia and South Ossetia, and Moldova and Transnistria, disputes over borders, cultural rights, and political power turned into violent clashes. The Soviet leadership faced the challenge of addressing these crises without the heavy-handed military responses that had been common in earlier decades.
The challenge for Gorbachev was that he still believed in preserving the Soviet Union, but in a reformed, more democratic form. He tried to offer greater autonomy to the republics while keeping them within a new, looser federation. But for many nationalist leaders, this wasn't enough. They had tasted the possibility of full independence, and they weren't willing to settle for less. The momentum for separation was becoming unstoppable.
Western media coverage also played a role in inspiring nationalist movements. Under Glasnost, Soviet citizens had greater access to foreign broadcasts and newspapers. They could see how other nations lived, and they could share their own struggles with the world. International attention gave these movements a sense of legitimacy and put pressure on the Soviet government to avoid harsh crackdowns.
By the end of the 1980s, nationalist movements had become a defining feature of Soviet politics. The once unshakable image of a united USSR was crumbling. Instead of a single identity as Soviet citizens, people were beginning to see themselves primarily as Estonians, Ukrainians, Georgians, or Armenians. This shift in identity was perhaps the greatest sign that the Soviet Union, in its traditional form, could not survive much longer.
In our next section, we'll explore how these internal pressures connected with external forces. The Soviet Union was not only dealing with nationalism at home, but also facing major changes in the international arena. As the Cold War wound down, the USSR's role in the world was shifting. and that shift would have a huge impact on its fate.
While nationalist movements were reshaping the Soviet Union from within, there was another major factor influencing events: the dramatic changes in global politics at the end of the Cold War. For decades, the USSR and the United States had been locked in a constant geopolitical rivalry, competing for influence across the globe. By the late 1980s, that rivalry was softening, but the new reality created its own set of pressures for Moscow.
The Soviet war in Afghanistan had been one of the most costly and unpopular foreign ventures in Soviet history. It began in 1979 as an effort to prop up a communist government in Kabul, but over the years it became a grinding guerrilla war against well-armed Afghan resistance fighters, many of whom were supported by the United States and other Western nations. By the time Gorbachev decided to withdraw Soviet troops in 1989, tens of thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded, and public faith in the military had been badly shaken.
Ending the war in Afghanistan was a priority for Gorbachev, but it also sent a message to the world. The Soviet Union was no longer willing or able to project military power in the same way it had during the height of the Cold War. That retreat had ripple effects far beyond Afghanistan. Countries in Eastern Europe, which had long relied on the threat of Soviet military intervention to keep their communist governments in place, began to sense that Moscow's grip was loosening.
In 1989, this shift became dramatically clear. One by one, the communist governments of Eastern Europe fell: Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania all experienced revolutions or political transitions. The most iconic moment came in November 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. For decades, that wall had symbolized the division between East and West, communism and capitalism. Its collapse was not only a blow to the East German regime, but also a symbolic defeat for Soviet influence in Europe.
What's remarkable is that the Soviet Union did not send in tanks to stop these changes. In earlier decades, uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 had been crushed by Soviet forces. But now, Gorbachev's policy was different. He believed that each country should choose its own path. This so-called Sinatra Doctrine, named after the song My Way, effectively gave Eastern European states permission to break free from Soviet control without fear of military intervention.
For the United States and its allies, these developments marked a huge victory. US President George H.W. Bush and other Western leaders saw Gorbachev as a genuine partner in reducing global tensions. High-level meetings between Washington and Moscow led to arms control agreements, including the 1987 Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. These agreements not only lowered the risk of nuclear war, but also signaled a fundamental change in the Cold War dynamic.
However, inside the Soviet Union, not everyone saw these diplomatic achievements as victories. Hardliners in the Communist Party and the military believed that Gorbachev was giving away too much for too little in return. They felt that the USSR was abandoning its allies, losing its global influence, and showing weakness at a time when it could least afford it. This criticism would become increasingly important in the political battles ahead.
Another aspect of the changing global environment was economic. The late 1980s saw a rapid acceleration of globalization, with Western economies expanding their technological and financial power. The Soviet Union, still struggling with shortages and inefficiencies at home, found it increasingly difficult to compete. The collapse of oil prices in the mid-1980s further damaged the Soviet economy, since oil exports were a key source of hard currency for Moscow.
The USSR also faced growing pressure from international financial institutions and Western governments to reform its economic system if it wanted trade deals, investment, and credit. Gorbachev tried to open the Soviet economy to more foreign business, but deep structural problems meant that these efforts produced limited results. Instead of revitalizing the economy quickly, foreign exposure often highlighted just how far behind the USSR had fallen in consumer goods, technology, and productivity.
There's also an important psychological element here. As Soviet citizens gained greater access to Western media and culture, they could see the differences in living standards more clearly than ever before. They saw full supermarket shelves, modern technology, and vibrant political debates in Western democracies. This comparison fueled dissatisfaction and made the Soviet promise of eventual prosperity feel hollow.
By 1990, the Soviet Union was in a weakened position both domestically and internationally. It had lost much of its control over Eastern Europe, was withdrawing from costly foreign conflicts, and was struggling to maintain economic stability. At the same time, the world was rapidly changing. The United States was emerging as the sole superpower, and a new era of international relations was beginning to take shape.
All these international pressures didn't just add stress to the Soviet system, they actively accelerated its collapse. Without the unifying force of the Cold War rivalry, it became harder to justify the sacrifices and hardships of the Soviet model. And with fewer resources and less authority on the world stage, Moscow was losing the ability to hold its diverse republics together through either persuasion or force.
In our next section, we'll examine a dramatic turning point, the August 1991 coup attempt. This event, led by hardliners determined to reverse Gorbachev's reforms, would backfire spectacularly, speeding up the very collapse they hoped to prevent. It's a moment of high drama that showed just how divided the Soviet leadership had become.
By the summer of 1991, the Soviet Union was in a state of political freefall. Nationalist movements were surging across the republics, the economy was deteriorating, and Moscow's influence abroad had shrunk dramatically. Gorbachev was pushing for a new union treaty that would transform the USSR into a looser federation, giving republics much greater autonomy. He believed this was the only way to keep the country together peacefully. But for the hardliners in the Communist Party and military, it felt like the end of the Soviet Union itself.
These hardliners had spent their entire careers believing in the strength and unity of the Soviet system. They saw Gorbachev's policies, Perestroika, Glasnost, and the abandonment of Eastern Europe as acts of surrender. In their eyes, the reforms had unleashed chaos, destroyed discipline, and weakened the USSR on the world stage. They were convinced that unless they acted, the Soviet Union would cease to exist. And so, they began to plan a decisive intervention.
On August 18, 1991, while Gorbachev was on vacation in his dacha in Crimea, a group of 8 top officials calling themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency placed him under house arrest. They claimed he was too ill to govern and announced that Vice President Gennady Yanayev would take over as acting leader. The coup plotters included senior figures from the KGB, the military, and the Communist Party, all men with deep ties to the old system.
The coup leaders immediately moved to take control of Moscow. Tanks rolled into the city, troops surrounded key government buildings, and censorship was reimposed on the media. They banned strikes and protests, declared a state of emergency, and broadcast statements promising to restore order and discipline. But their tone and tactics felt eerily familiar to Soviet citizens who had lived through earlier crackdowns, and for many people, it was a sign that the clock was being turned back to a darker time.
The problem for the coup plotters was that the world, and the Soviet Union, had changed dramatically since the days of the Brezhnev era. Thanks to Glasnost, people were no longer afraid to speak out, and the press had become more independent. In Moscow, thousands of citizens began to gather to protest the coup. They built barricades around the Russian Parliament building, also known as the White House, determined to defend the elected government of the Russian Federation.
At the center of the resistance was Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Federation and a political rival of Gorbachev. Yeltsin had been a vocal critic of the Communist Party and a champion of greater democracy and market reforms. During the coup, he emerged as the symbol of defiance. Famously, on August 19th, he climbed onto a tank outside the White House and addressed the crowd, calling for a general strike and urging soldiers not to follow illegal orders.
Images of Yeltsin standing on that tank, holding a piece of paper and speaking to the crowd, were broadcast around the world. They became one of the defining moments of the Soviet Union's final days. The sight of a leader openly defying the coup and rallying ordinary citizens captured the spirit of the times. The people were no longer willing to be silenced, and they were ready to take risks to defend their freedoms.
The coup began to unravel quickly. Some military units refused to follow orders to attack the protesters, while others simply withdrew. The streets of Moscow filled with civilians determined to stop the tanks through peaceful means. Meanwhile, in Leningrad and other major cities, demonstrations against the coup grew larger by the hour. The plotters had expected fear and obedience, but what they encountered instead was resistance and unity.
By August 21st, just 3 days after it began, the coup collapsed. The plotters fled or were arrested, and Gorbachev was freed from his confinement in Crimea. But while Gorbachev returned to Moscow as president, his authority had been fatally damaged. The failed coup had exposed just how little control the central government still had, and how powerful the new political forces in the republics had become.
In many ways, the coup attempt backfired spectacularly. Instead of saving the Soviet Union, it accelerated its disintegration. Several republics that had been hesitant about declaring independence before the coup now moved quickly to do so. They argued that the coup showed the dangers of remaining in a union where anti-democratic forces could still seize power. The momentum toward dissolution became unstoppable.
The coup also transformed Boris Yeltsin into the most powerful political figure in the Soviet Union. His bold public resistance and his ability to rally both ordinary citizens and sections of the military made him a national hero. In the months that followed, Yeltsin would play a central role in negotiating the final agreements that dissolved the USSR and replaced it with a new political entity, the Commonwealth of Independent States.
For the Soviet people, those 3 days in August 1991 were filled with uncertainty, tension, and the sense that history was being written in real time. For the rest of the world, they offered a dramatic glimpse into the fragility of the Soviet system and the speed with which decades of political order could unravel. The stage was now set for the final chapter of the Soviet Union, a chapter that would close before the year was out.
In our next section, we'll walk through those last few months of 1991, how the remaining republics declared independence, how the Union's central institutions broke down, and how, on December 25th, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new, uncertain world.
The collapse of the August coup left the Soviet Union reeling. In the immediate aftermath, Gorbachev tried to resume his role as president and push ahead with the Union Treaty, but the political balance had shifted decisively. The coup had not only exposed the fragility of the central government, it had also convinced many republics that independence was the safest path forward. Over the next few months, the breakup of the USSR went from a possibility to an inevitability.
One of the most striking developments was the rapid pace at which republics declared independence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been pressing for full sovereignty for years, and within days of the coup's collapse, they received international recognition for their independence. Other republics, including Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, and Georgia, soon followed. Even large, historically central parts of the Union were ready to go their own way.
Ukraine's decision was particularly significant. In December 1991, a nationwide referendum was held in which over 90% of voters supported independence from the Soviet Union. Ukraine was not just another republic. It was the second most populous and economically important part of the USSR after Russia. Its departure meant that any realistic hope of keeping the Union intact had evaporated.
Meanwhile, Boris Yeltsin was consolidating his authority as president of the Russian Federation. He began to take control over key Soviet institutions within Russia, from the armed forces to the media. While Gorbachev still held the title of Soviet President, his power was largely symbolic by this point. Yeltsin's government in Moscow became the center of political gravity, while the old Soviet ministries struggled to remain relevant.
Internationally, the changes were happening almost as quickly as at home. Western governments, which had been cautious about directly supporting independence movements earlier in the year, now began to recognize the new states emerging from the Soviet collapse. The United Nations prepared to admit the former Soviet republics as independent members, and global markets started adjusting to the idea of dealing with multiple new governments in place of a single superpower.
The actual mechanics of dissolving the Soviet Union were complex. There were questions about how to divide the military, how to handle nuclear weapons spread across several republics, and how to apportion foreign debts and assets. The most urgent concern was the nuclear arsenal, which was the largest in the world at the time. The United States and other powers were deeply concerned about maintaining control over these weapons during such a chaotic political transition.
Negotiations between the republics intensified in late 1991. On December 8th, Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus in a forest retreat in Belarus, known as Belovezhskaya Pushcha. There, they signed an agreement declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed and announcing the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS. It was an extraordinary moment. 3 republics had just declared the end of a superpower without Gorbachev's involvement.
When Gorbachev learned about the agreement, he was furious. He insisted that the Soviet Union still existed and that only a broader group of republics could decide its fate. But events were moving faster than he could control. Within days, more republics joined the CIS, and the Central Soviet institutions, from the Ministry of Defense to the KGB, began to either dissolve or come under Russian control.
The final blow came on December 25, 1991. Gorbachev went on national television to announce his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. In his speech, he acknowledged that the country he had led no longer existed in its old form, and he expressed regret that the Union had ended in this way. It was a subdued, almost somber moment, marking the close of an era that had dominated global politics for nearly 70 years.
That evening, the Soviet flag, the red banner with the hammer and sickle, was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place, the Russian tricolor was raised. Around the world, viewers watched the images and understood that a chapter of history had ended. The Cold War was over, the bipolar world order had vanished, and a new, uncertain era was beginning.
For the people living in the former Soviet republics, the days that followed were filled with mixed emotions. Some celebrated their newfound independence and the possibility of building democratic, prosperous states. Others felt a deep sense of loss, remembering the Soviet Union as a source of stability, identity, and superpower status. For many, the transition was less about political ideals and more about coping with immediate economic and social upheaval.
Economically, the collapse created shockwaves. The old central planning system was gone, but the new market systems were only partially in place. Trade between the former republics broke down, industries collapsed, and inflation soared. In Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere, ordinary citizens saw their savings evaporate almost overnight. The promise of democracy was tempered by the harsh realities of economic survival.
On the global stage, the United States emerged as the sole superpower, shaping the geopolitical landscape for the next 3 decades. The former Soviet states had to navigate a world where they were no longer bound together by a shared ideology or centralized leadership. Some leaned toward closer ties with the West, while others sought to maintain closer relations with Russia. The geopolitical chessboard had been completely rearranged.
In our next section, we'll explore the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse, the political, economic, and social challenges faced by the newly independent states, the role of Russia as the USSR's successor, and the long-term consequences of 1991 for global politics. It's a story of transition, adaptation, and the struggle to define a new future after the fall of an empire.
The dissolution of the Soviet Union in late 1991 was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey for the newly independent states. Overnight, 15 countries found themselves responsible for building new political systems, economies, and international relationships from scratch. Many of these republics faced enormous challenges: political instability, economic collapse, and social upheaval. The collapse did not instantly bring freedom and prosperity. For many, it brought uncertainty and hardship.
Absolutely. The sudden transition from a centralized command economy to market-oriented systems was particularly difficult. Many industries had been deeply integrated across the Soviet republics, so breaking those economic ties disrupted supply chains and trade networks. Inflation skyrocketed as price controls were removed, and unemployment, previously hidden by guaranteed jobs, soared. For ordinary citizens, life became unpredictable and difficult. Basic goods were often scarce, and social services deteriorated.
Russia, as the USSR's largest successor state, inherited most of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, military, and foreign debts, but it also inherited many of the problems. Boris Yeltsin became Russia's first president and embarked on a bold but controversial program of shock therapy economic reforms, aimed at rapidly moving the country toward capitalism. Privatization programs transferred state assets into private hands, but these processes were often corrupt and led to the rise of powerful oligarchs.
Political turmoil was also rampant. Across the former Soviet space, new governments struggled to balance democratization with maintaining order. Some republics experienced violent conflicts, often along ethnic lines. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan intensified, and separatist movements in places like Chechnya led to brutal wars. Meanwhile, some former Soviet republics took different paths, with some embracing closer ties to Russia and others looking westward towards Europe and NATO.
The social fabric of these countries was also strained. The shared Soviet identity had helped unify diverse populations, but after the fall, many faced challenges of national identity, language politics, and integration. In multi-ethnic states, tensions sometimes flared into violence. The sudden collapse of social safety nets meant that many people faced poverty and insecurity for the first time in their lives.
Internationally, the new states had to quickly establish diplomatic relations and join global institutions. The Commonwealth of Independent States offered a loose framework for cooperation, but it lacked strong enforcement mechanisms. Some republics pursued full independence and integration into Western institutions like the European Union and NATO, while others sought to maintain economic and security ties with Russia.
One of the lasting legacies of the Soviet collapse has been the complicated relationship between Russia and its neighbors. Russia viewed the loss of its empire as a strategic and psychological blow. It sought to maintain influence in the region through economic ties, political pressure, and, in some cases, military intervention. These tensions continue to shape regional and global politics today.
Despite all the difficulties, many of the former Soviet republics have made important strides in building independent nations. They have developed their own cultures, political systems, and economies. Some have experienced significant economic growth and democratic progress, while others continue to face serious challenges. The legacy of the Soviet Union remains, but the future belongs to these new independent states.
It's also important to recognize that the collapse of the Soviet Union fundamentally reshaped global politics. The end of the bipolar Cold War era gave way to a new world order dominated by the United States, but also marked by new challenges like regional conflicts, the spread of nuclear weapons, and shifting alliances. The effects of 1991 are still felt in international relations today.
In our final section, we'll reflect on the broader significance of the Soviet Union's fall, what it teaches us about political change, the limits of centralized power, and the complex paths nations take when old systems collapse. It's a story with lessons for history, politics, and all of us interested in how the world evolves.
As we come to the end of our deep dive into the fall of the Soviet Union, it's important to pause and reflect on the many lessons this historic event offers. The collapse was more than just the end of a country. It was a powerful reminder of how complex and fragile political systems can be. The Soviet Union lasted for nearly 70 years, yet in the space of a few years, decades of power and control unraveled dramatically.
That's right. One key lesson is about the dangers of rigidity and inflexibility in governance. The Soviet system was incredibly centralized and controlled, which initially allowed rapid industrial growth and military power. But over time, that rigidity prevented the system from adapting to changing social, economic, and political realities. When a system cannot evolve, it risks collapse from pressures building beneath the surface.
Another important lesson comes from the role of ideas and identities. The Soviet Union tried to create a unified Soviet identity to bind together its many diverse peoples. But those deep-rooted national, cultural, and historical identities could not be fully erased. When people began openly expressing their distinctiveness and grievances under Glasnost, it showed that political legitimacy requires more than force or ideology. It requires respecting the identity and aspirations of people.
The story also highlights how economic health and political stability are closely linked. The stagnation and inefficiencies of the Soviet economy, combined with the inability to meet citizens' needs, weakened faith in the government. Attempts to reform the economy in the late 1980s came too late and were too cautious, revealing how difficult it can be to fix deeply entrenched problems without fundamental change.
Gorbachev's leadership is a fascinating study in reform and unintended consequences. His desire to save the Soviet Union through openness and restructuring ended up accelerating its demise. It shows the delicate balance leaders face when trying to change entrenched systems. Reforms can empower forces that go beyond what any one person or government can control.
We also learn from the international dimension. The Cold War rivalry shaped much of the Soviet Union's policies and self-image. Once that rivalry diminished, the rationale for the Soviet system weakened too. The global context matters deeply. Domestic changes are often intertwined with international pressures and shifts in global power.
It's also worth considering the human dimension. Behind all the political upheaval were millions of people whose lives were transformed by these changes. Some faced hardship, conflict, and uncertainty, while others embraced new opportunities and freedoms. History isn't just about states and leaders, it's about the people who live through these monumental events.
And finally, the fall of the Soviet Union reminds us that history is not predetermined. Political systems, no matter how powerful they seem, can change rapidly due to internal dynamics, leadership decisions, social movements, and external events. It's a powerful reminder to pay attention to the signs of change, the voices of people, and the risks of complacency.
For students of history, politics, and international relations, the Soviet collapse is a rich case study, a moment when ideology, economics, culture, and power intersected in dramatic ways. Its effects are still felt around the world today, shaping the policies and politics of nations across Eurasia and beyond.
As we wrap up, we invite you to think about what this history means for our own time. How do political systems respond to crises? What lessons can be drawn about leadership, reform, and identity? The fall of the Soviet Union may seem distant, but its story continues to offer insights into the challenges facing countries today.
Thanks so much for joining us on this journey through one of the 20th century's most significant global turning points. We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of how complex and interconnected history really is. Please like the video if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the English Globe for more deep discussions, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what you think about today's topic.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. Did any part of the Soviet Union's fall surprise you? What lessons do you think are most important? Your opinions enrich this conversation and help us create content that matters. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to exploring more history together soon.